We have another installment of Among the Hidden, Chapter 7. By mid-September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn just for the chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. They all rushed now. Mother had to be at the factory by 7. Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before harvest, and Matthew and Mark were back in school. Only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it over to him, all the while pretending, for the sake of the open window, that they'd just forgotten something upstairs. As soon as the rest of his family had stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents. First out the front, to see Matthew and Mark climb onto the school bus, then out the back, where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions, as large as the Garner's house and barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as though their walls were studded with precious jewels. For all Luke knew, maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into the houses first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic. Expensive-looking cars driving slowly down the newly paved streets. Sometimes they pulled into a driveway and went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking non-stop. It had taken Luke a while to figure it out. He certainly hadn't dared ask anyone else in the family. But he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying the houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He'd overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich. Luke knew. They had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the barons had gotten rich when everybody else was poor, but Dad never said the word baron without a curse word or two in front of it. The people streaming through the houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. They were mostly thin, beautiful women in form-fitting dresses, and heavy-set men in what Luke's dad and brothers called sissy clothes, shiny shoes, and clean dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family that they never looked like any of the barons. Luke preferred it when the adults had children with them, and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were always as dressed up as their parents, with hair bows and suspenders and other gewgaws Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they'd grabbed first out of their closet that morning. Though he knew no one would dare show up with 3 kids, he always counted 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. What if a family with just 1 kid moved in behind them, and he sneaked into their house and pretended to be their second child? He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke. Luke living with barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing, or turned in. When he began thinking things like that, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother had taught him to read and to do math as much as she knew herself. "At least we have a few books for you," she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He'd read all their books dozens of times, even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that let him pretend he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. He liked to forget he was Luke Garner, 3rd child, hidden in the attic. Sometime around noon, he'd hear the door from the mudroom to the kitchen swing open, and he'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. Without Mother there were no homemade pies now, no mashed potatoes, no roasts that sent good smells throughout the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He explained that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering. But he did turn the radio on for the noon farm report, and there was usually a song or 2 after that before Dad silenced the radio and went outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room to read or watch the houses again. At 6:30, Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to do a whole day's work in the few hours before bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came up to visit him too, but they could never stay long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do homework afterwards. And they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors. Before the woods came down, the 3 of them often had played kickball or football or spud in the backyard after school and chores. I don't know what spud is. Matthew and Mark always fought about who got to have Luke on his team, because even if Luke wasn't very good, 2 boys together could always beat the 3rd. Now they played half-hearted games of cards or checkers with Luke, but Luke could tell they'd rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end, when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour sometimes, asking him what he'd read that day or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night, when she was telling how her plastic glove had gotten stuck in a chicken she'd de-gutted that day, Mother suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Mother?" Luke said. She answered with a snore. She'd fallen asleep sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that the hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. "Mother?" he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. "But I cleaned that chicken all—" "Oh, sorry, Luke. You need tucking in, don't you?" She fluffed his pillow, smoothed his sheet. Luke sat up. "That's okay, Mother. I'm getting too old for that anyway." He swallowed a lump in his throat. "Anyway, I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew or Mark in when they were 12. "No," she said quietly. "Then I don't need it either." "Okay," she said. She kissed his forehead anyhow, then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left. Chapter 8. One cool, rainy morning, a few weeks later, Luke's family left in such a rush they barely had time to say goodbye. They dashed out the door after breakfast, Matthew and Mark complaining about their packed lunches, Dad calling back, "I'm going to that auction up at Shittlesville. Won't be home until supper." Mother hurried back and handed Luke a bag of cracklings and 3 pears and some biscuits from the night before. She muttered, "So you won't get hungry," and gave him a quick kiss on the head. Then she was gone too. Luke peeked around the stairway door, surveying the chaos of dirty pans and crumb-covered plates left in the kitchen. He knew not to look out as far as the window, but he did anyway. His heart gave a strange jump when he saw the window was covered. Someone must have pulled the shade the night before to try to keep the kitchen warm, and then forgotten to raise it in the morning. Luke dared to lean out a little further. Yes, the shade was down on the other window too. For the first time in almost 6 months, he could step out into the kitchen and not worry about being seen. He could run, skip, jump, dance even on the vast linoleum floor without fear. He could clean up the kitchen and surprise Mother. He could do anything. He put his right foot out tentatively, not quite daring to put his full weight on it. The floor squeaked. He froze. Nothing happened, but he retreated anyway. He went back up the stairs, crawled along the 2nd floor hallway to avoid the windows, then climbed the stairs to the attic. He was so disgusted with himself he could taste it. "I am a coward. I am a chicken. I deserve to be locked away in the attic forever," ran through his head. No, he countered himself. "I'm cautious. I'm making a plan." He climbed up onto the stool on top of a trunk that served as his perch for watching out the back fence. The neighborhood behind his house was fully occupied now. He knew all the families had come up with names for most of them, and the Big Car family had 4 expensive cars sitting in their driveway. The Gold family all had hair the color of sunshine. The Bird Brain family had set a row of 30 bird houses along their backyard fence, even though Luke could have told them it was pointless to do that until spring. The house he could see best, right behind the Garner's backyard, was occupied by the Sports family. 2 teenage boys lived there, and their deck overflowed with soccer balls, baseball bats, tennis rackets, basketballs, hockey sticks, and apparatus from games Luke could only guess at. Today he wasn't interested in games. He was interested in seeing the families leave. He had noticed before that all of the houses were empty by 9 in the morning, with kids off to school and grown-ups off to work. 3 or 4 of the women didn't seem to have jobs, but they left too, returning late in the afternoon with shopping bags. Today he just had to make sure no one was staying home sick. The Gold family left first. 2 blonde heads in one car, 2 blonde heads in another. The Sports family was next, the boys carrying football pads and helmets, their mother teetering on high heels. Then there was a flurry of cars streaming from every driveway onto the still sparkling new streets. Luke counted each person, keeping track so carefully that he made scratches on the wall and counted the scratches twice again at the end. Yes, 28 people gone. He was safe. Luke scrambled down from his chair, his head spinning with plans. First, he'd clean up the kitchen. Then he'd start some bread for supper. He'd never made bread before, but he'd watched Mother a million times. Then maybe he could pull the shades in the rest of the house and clean it thoroughly. He couldn't vacuum, that'd be too loud, but he could dust and scrub and polish. Mother would be so pleased. Then in the afternoon, before Matthew or Mark or the kids in the neighborhood got back, he could put something on for supper. Maybe potato soup. Why, he could do this every day. He'd never considered housework or cooking particularly thrilling before. Matthew and Mark always scoffed at it as women's work. But it was better than nothing. And maybe, just maybe, if this worked, he could convince Dad to let him sneak out to the barn and help there too. Luke was so excited. He stepped into the kitchen without a second thought this time. Who cared if the floor creaked? No one was there to hear it. He gathered up dishes from the table and piled them into the sink, scrubbing everything with extraordinary zeal. That means, like, excitement and hard work. He measured out flour and lard and milk and yeast and was putting it all in a bowl when it occurred to him it might be okay to turn on the radio. Very softly. Nobody'd hear, and if they did, they'd just figure the family had forgotten to turn it off, just as they'd forgotten to raise the shades. The bread was in the oven, and Luke was picking up lint by hand from the living room rug when he heard tires on the gravel driveway. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Too early for the school bus, or Mother, or Dad. Luke sprinted for the stairs, hoping whoever it was would just go away. No luck. He heard the side door creaking open. Then Dad exclaiming, "What?" He was back early. That shouldn't matter. But hiding on the staircase, Luke suddenly felt like the radio was as loud as an entire orchestra, like the smell of baking bread could fill 3 counties. "Luke!" Dad yelled. Luke heard his father's hand on the doorknob. He opened the door. "I was just trying to help," Luke blubbered. "I was safe. You left the shades down, so I thought it was okay, and I made sure everyone was gone from the neighborhood, and—" Dad glared. "You can't be sure," he snapped. "People like that, they get deliveries all the time. They get sick and come home from work. They have maids come during the day." Luke could have protested. No, the maids never came before the kids got home from school, but he didn't want to give himself away any more than he already had. "The shades were down," he said. "I didn't turn on a single light. Even if there were 1,000 people back there, nobody would know I was here. Please, I've just got to do something. Look, I made bread and cleaned up And what if a government inspector or someone had stopped by here? It would have hidden, like always. Dad was shaking his head. And leave them smelling bread baking in an empty house? You don't seem to understand, he said. You can't take any chances. You can't, because... At that precise moment, the buzzer on the oven went off, sounding as loud as a siren. Dad gave Luke a dirty look and stalked over to the oven. He pulled out the 2 bread pans and tossed them on the stovetop. He flipped off the radio. I don't want you in the kitchen again, he said. You stay hidden. That's an order. He went out the door without looking back. Luke fled up the stairs. He wanted to stomp angrily, but he couldn't. No noise allowed. In his room he hesitated, too upset to read, too restless to do anything else. He kept hearing, you stay hidden. That's an order, echoing in his ears. But he'd been hidden. He'd been careful. To prove his point, to himself at least, he climbed back on to his perch by the back vents and looked out on the quiet neighborhood. All the driveways were empty. Nothing moved, not even the flag on the Gold family's flagpole or the spokes on the Birdbrain family's fake windmill. And then out of the corner of his eye, Luke caught a glimpse of something behind one window of the Sports family's house. A face. A child's face. In a house where 2 boys already lived. Do we have time for one more chapter? Yes. Chapter 9. Luke was so surprised he lost his balance and almost fell backwards off the trunk. By the time he recovered, he righted himself. The face was gone. Had he imagined it? Was it just one of the Sports family brothers home early from school? Kids got sick, like Dad said, or they decided to play hooky. Luke tried to remember every detail of the face he'd seen, or thought he'd seen. It had been younger than either of the Sports family brothers, softer. Hadn't it? Maybe it was a thief, or a maid come early. No, it had been a child. He didn't even let himself think what another child in that house would be. He stared for hours at the Sports family's house, but no face reappeared. Nothing happened until 6, when the 2 Sports family boys drove in their Jeep, unloaded their football gear, and carried it into the house. They didn't run out screaming about being robbed. And he'd seen no thief leave. He'd seen no maid leave. At 6:30, Luke reluctantly climbed down from his perch when he heard his mother's knock on the door. He sat down on his bed and mothered a distracted, "Come in." She rushed to hug him. "Luke, I'm sorry. I know you were just trying to help and everything is amazingly clean. I'd love it if you could do this every day. But your father thinks... you can't." Luke was so busy thinking about the face in the window that at first he couldn't figure out what she was talking about. Oh, the bread, the house cleaning, the radio. "That's okay," Luke mumbled. But it wasn't, and it never would be. His anger came back. Why did his parents have to be so careful? Why didn't they just lock him in one of the trunks in the attic and be done with it? "Can't you talk to him?" Luke asked. "Can't you convince him?" Mother pushed Luke's hair back from his face. "I'll try," she said. "But he's just trying to protect you. We can't take any chances." Even if the face in the window of the Sports family house was another 3rd child, so what? Luke and the other kid could live right next door all their lives and never meet. Luke might never see the other kid again, and he'd certainly never see Luke. Luke lowered his head. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "There's nothing for me to do. Am I supposed to just sit in this room the rest of my life?" Mother was stroking his hair now. It made him feel itchy and irritable. "Oh, Lukey," she said, "you can do so much. Read and play and sleep whenever you want. Believe me, I'd like to live a day of your life right about now." "No, you wouldn't," Luke muttered, but he said it so softly he was sure Mother couldn't hear. He knew she wouldn't understand. If there was a third child in the sports family, would he understand? Did he feel the way Luke did? It's the end of chapter 9. So, what do you think you would feel like if that was something that you had to do? What if you were Luke and your family went to work and your family went to school, but you had to stay hidden and you weren't really allowed out of your room and you weren't allowed to look out the windows? And they're poor, so they don't have internet, they don't have tablets, they don't have TVs that he can watch because he has to be quiet. What would you do all day? He doesn't have any more books that he hasn't read. Send me a message. What would you do all day? Would you like to be in Luke's place?